I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute. I'm standing in today for Ambassador Dirigian, the director who wanted to be here to introduce our speaker, but who had some travel complications. The Baker Institute has many functions, but its primary function is to conduct research into the world of public policy. We have a number of endowed positions, research positions, that we use to bring in for short periods of time, a year, 2 years, practitioners from the world of policy and sometimes scholars from the world of policy. And as it happens, our speaker tonight, Terry Sullivan, has been a Baker Institute Research Fellow. So we welcome him home, really, to the Baker Institute. Professor Sullivan, did you come from Texas? You certainly did a lot of study here.
I grew up here.
Yeah, he attended the University of Texas, got his BA there, got his PhD from there, and then has had a distinguished career in the world of political science. He's currently professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's an expert on the White House. He's an expert on the Congress, and he teaches courses on those subjects at that university. When he was here from 1999 to 2001, he addressed a major problem of public policy. That is the transition from old administrations to new administrations. Since Clinton was concluding his second term in 2000, no matter who won, the new president was going to face the problem of a transition. And it's not easy. Essentially, he studied the transition of the White House and the 7 offices in the White House. You have only, after you're elected, a few weeks to staff the White House, though in practice people begin to research appointments long before that. And one day the old administration is gone, the next day the new administration takes over, and it's not unusual for people not to know exactly where their offices is or how to use the phone. And that's a problem of government. So Professor Sullivan undertook during his residency here at Rice to study transitions, and in particular to prepare the new administration for how to conduct a transition, how to take over. He has published a number of books. One of those books came out of his work while he was a fellow at the Baker Institute. Actually, 2 books. The first one was The White House World. It's actually a collection of briefing papers for the incoming members of the new administration on how to do their jobs. While he was here, he was also the coordinator of what he called the Washington Forum on the Role of the White House Chief of Staff. He brought together 12 of the 15 chiefs of staff who had served in the White House from 1969 to 1999. And they sat around and talked. And what they talked about was how to recruit and organize a White House staff. That conference was so interesting that Professor Sullivan turned it into a book he edited. The title of that is The Nerve Center, Lessons in Governing from the White House Chief of Staffs. It's his new book. I hold it in my hand. It's virtually hot off the press, and he's agreed to talk about this subject tonight. And so I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Baker Institute Professor Terry Sullivan. Incidentally, at the conclusion of his talk, Professor Sullivan will take questions till about 7:15.
No, that's okay. I've got another copy.
Just in case I walk away with it, which I often do.
Thank you, Dr. Matisow. It's nice to be back in Houston and at Rice. When I began preparations for the White House Transition Project, I had no idea that it would eventually bring me to Houston, Texas, and to Rice University. But the fact of the matter is, Ed Dirigian did. Early in 1998, he was approached by the American Enterprise Institute to represent the Baker Institute on an advisory board for their Transition to Governing project. And right off, he saw that the scope of the Institute's participation in that project was not nearly significant enough to honor properly the Institute's namesake, who, after all, to this date, has still served as Chief of Staff for longer than any other person. So, thank you to Ambassador Durigen for that cool judgment and good sense to bring me to the Institute. And before I get started on this talk, I'd like to take advantage of your patience just a little bit longer to thank three other people who played an important role in this book. First, I want to thank Miss Nancy Jo Allen, who many of you know, whose support for this project made sure that the Institute had everything it needed to mount the forum on the White House Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C. When the forum was finished, another of the Baker family stepped up to lend a hand. She spent several hours of her own time poring over the transcript that came from this conversation between the White House Chiefs of Staff. I want to personally acknowledge Miss Robbie DeVries of the Roundtable for that service. Many of you know Robbie, I'm sure. When I recently talked about transitions at the LBJ school, they gave me a coffee cup, which had inscribed on it, "I gave a talk at the LBJ school and all I got was this lousy mug." I wish I had been able to convince my publisher that Robbie deserved her own special page in this book, but all she got was this lousy book too. She did that work in the same public spirit that others on the Roundtable support the Institute so well, believing that service is often the best reward. And so I'd like to convey my thanks publicly to Robbie. And lastly, I'd like to thank Secretary James Baker. When the forum had ended and we were standing around basking in its glow at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, Secretary Baker came over to a clump of political scientists and reporters who had gathered together, including me, all of us political science geeks standing around talking about the conference. Secretary Baker stepped into that circle and, putting his hand on my shoulder, declared, "Wasn't this great?" Of course, we all agreed, after all. And then, in front of my professional colleagues and Washington reporters, he gave me the great honor of declaring, "And it was Terry's idea." You cannot imagine how often I have relived that moment to my friends. When the chorus of agreement had died down from my colleagues, Secretary Baker said, of course, "While it was Terry's idea, I gathered these cats together." When I proposed the forum, several reporters and others who should have known better said that the forum was doomed from the start. We would never get more than a handful of the former chiefs to show up. After all, they never had before. No one had ever accomplished that feat. Secretary Baker's call to the former chiefs, however, resulted in every one of them shifting their schedules for the forum. In fact, one of them, a very important one of them, sat for 7 hours in the Chicago airport in a blizzard trying to make the forum, and when he couldn't get there, he volunteered what had then become his extremely valuable time to the book so that he could be counted among those who had contributed. In any case, I want to publicly acknowledge Secretary Baker for his service, his integrity, his good spirit, and especially his skill at cat wrangling. The success of the Presidential Transition Project at the Baker Institute rests upon one simple principle. We set out to create a bridge from those who had borne responsibilities to those who would bear them. That the former chiefs eventually were speaking to someone many of them knew very well, many, after all, had had Andy Card in their own White House operations, was hardly the point. The White House Nerve Center, of course, is a unique institution. Its daily activities set the course for world history. One former press, and its every word gets worldwide attention. One former press secretary recalled that when I worked for the Speaker of the House, the number 2 man in American government, the press listened to me in paragraphs. When I worked in the White House, they listened to me in syllables. At the core of this nerve center, a bureaucratic operation extends the reach and magnifies the voice of the American president. The White House Chief of Staff manages that operation. As the last president to try not having a chief of staff, even if only for a short period, President Gerald Ford's judgment on this subject carries a special message. He said, what we do not know about this office imperils the Republic. And the range of what we do not know astonishes. No systematic scholarly literature has ever developed to answer the critical questions facing a White House Chief of Staff. Since the forum, though, at least 3 scholarly efforts have begun working on the Chief of Staff office, trying to codify the principles articulated in this new book. What are those principles? As has become the tradition in late-night TV, I will offer tonight a top 10 list of what we know about governing from inside the White House, according to the White House Chiefs of Staff. Governing from the White House begins with people, of course. So, rule number 10, start by getting good people. But getting the right people is harder than it seems, and not just because you have to find them, but because for an administration you have to find so many of them. While the governor of a very large state, say Texas, for example, appoints a couple of hundred positions in government, the President of the United States is responsible for filling a little more than 6,000 positions in government. So, right now, I would like you to take a moment to consider just how many you think the President normally gets appointed in his first year in office. Take your time, consider it. Bet you didn't think you were going to have math problems to work tonight. 6,000 positions in government. How many of these positions does the President nominate in the first year? Okay, time's up. Let's just take a show of hands. Some offered, what was your number? Somebody said 4,500? 2,500? 6,000? Well, how many of you thought 1,500 nominations in office or more? Okay, that's good. Thanks. And put your hands down, thanks. I expect, because I have asked this question before, that very few of you would have guessed as little as 350 for the first year. The fact is, though, you were closer than anybody else. If this was Price of Right, you'd be the only one coming up on the stage. The fact is, though, that 350 nominations represents the record for the first year of any presidential series of nominations. This small number has nothing to do with partisan politics or gridlock or anything like that. Finding competent people, negotiating positions with them, clearing their backgrounds, and simply getting the paperwork done leaves little time to get more than a mere drop in the bucket nominated in the first year. You can imagine how frustrating this experience is for a candidate hoping to reshape government to discover that his administration is mostly empty desks for the first 2 years. 2 implications derive from this fact. One is recommended by the former chiefs of staff, and one has never been tried before, but which the Bush staff were prepared to use until Florida happened. The first recommendation is to concentrate on filling out the White House staff first and quickly. In this critical transition time when days matter, having clear lines of responsibility around the President is key to getting off the ground running and filling out the rest of the administration, including the President's cabinet. Consider for a moment that the average transition lasts 80 days. The average presidential transition takes about 70 days to get the White House staff selected. President Clinton, as an example, took 73 days. The Bush White House, on the other hand, came in well under that experience and under the average as well. Despite the delays surrounding the election and the Florida controversy, they set a record because they knew about this rule. The second implication, the one never tried, hinges on concentrating appointments in critical policy areas, which we call vertical policy staffing, and to stay some time here, I will reserve discussing this strategy for the question session. Lesson number 9, supporters can be more trouble than opponents. A lesson that every administration learns, usually the hard way, is that there is a permanent Washington community of policy advocates, organizations, and interests with a great deal of experience at articulating their goals. And even your friends among these groups see your new administration as an instrument with which to get their way and not their friend come to office. These groups work hard to hijack the President's agenda for their own purposes. One of President Bush's more colorful aides described working in this new environment by saying that when your friends begin to descend on you after election with their ideas about policy, you, quote, feel like a fire hydrant in a world of dogs, unquote. The chief protection for this problem, and every White House, however they come to office and whatever their goals, ends up adopting this practice, which is a very narrowly focused agenda. Thinking back on his experiences with the Reagan presidency, Secretary Baker used to say that in the White House, you get used to saying to your friends and others, I understand your interests, but we are concentrating on 1, 2, and 3. Saying this becomes the best defense for from these extraordinarily talented appeals for presidential time and effort. Controlling your agenda has its policy rewards. For example, the president's team spent a good deal of its time on its first priority, its tax cut, the picture I've used here for this section. The comment about the fire hydrant came primarily from the constant demands of supporters that the president include a favorite tax loophole in his tax cut proposal. Resisting these entreaties focused the president's agenda, and keeping focused on it resulted in the president signing a tax cut bill on day 107 of his administration. By comparison of the previous presidential attempts at tax cuts, this 100-day record was remarkable. President Reagan's historic cut didn't get through Congress and onto his desk until considerably later, and President Clinton, the last tax cut handled by a majority party, didn't get concluded until later than that. The Bush White House set a record on tax cuts because they appreciated this problem in advance. Lesson 8. Elections don't shorten the president's agenda, they complicate it. In America, we are ambivalent about our civil government. We often think it is consumed with politics, that everything is about elections and serving the friends of those in power. Speaker Sam Rayburn of Texas used to answer criticism of his own patronage practices by saying, quote, a politician who does not help his friends is not worthy to be the drunk in the smallest town in Texas. And we often think that statement sums up all of our politics. A good part of the debate at the forum revolved around an insistence by journalists that politics dominates the White House agenda, but the chiefs of staff agreed only that elections can complicate the opportunities for the president's agenda. Quote, you cannot avoid politics then, one said, because his body resides in the White House, whether he's a candidate for office or functioning as president. But above all else, all the chiefs agreed with President Reagan's last chief of staff, Ken Duberstein, that number 1, number 2, and number 3, the best politics, is good governing. And good governing often brings to the president's desk issues he would rather not face in an election year. Of course, President Carter would have preferred that there were no hostages in 1980. Thank you very much. No president wants a recession in their election year. Yet their agendas, even in election years, are full of exactly those kinds of issues. We often suppose that presidents control world events, but the chiefs will tell you that events come to the doorstep like the morning frost without your ever asking for them. The reality is that politics becomes just another complicating element in an already complicated process, and while presidents may enjoy the give and take and adventurous spirit that surrounds running for office, it is the business of governing that is the prize they seek and not the other way around. Lesson 7 is related to Lesson 8. The president's schedule must keep moving. Unlike every other national institution, the Congress, the courts, the executive agencies, the president is a prisoner of time, bound by the 22nd Amendment that no one, no matter how competent or popular, can serve more than 2 terms as president, that every president, in a sense, is and always will be a lame duck. Presidential time, then, has a high value, and this and the next lesson revolve around that fact. A central function of the president's staff is to orchestrate his day so that time in office is not wasted. Former Senator Howard Baker told the forum that his most shocking revelation when he became chief of staff upon taking over from Donald Reagan in the Reagan White House was that the president was sitting around idle. No one had prepared a schedule for him, and as such, the White House was coming apart at its seams. Quote, "So my real experience as chief of staff," unquote, he told them, "did not begin until we finally figured out the president's schedule. The president cannot just sit there." What the president should be doing, though, is not always that clear. Only 2 of the past 5 presidential transitions have actually sat down to figure out ahead of time what a president's typical schedule might look like. If they could figure out what previous presidents had done, they thought, then they could get some idea as to what to expect. We can evaluate what they learned by looking at those plans. For example, this table records the typical findings on 3 important presidential activities: holding press conferences, and meeting with congressional leaders, and meeting with interest groups. It also sets out the planned schedule for President Bush's first 100 days in these 3 categories. Note that while they certainly planned out fewer activities for the president in each of these categories, the differences are not that far off the average presidential schedule of activities. So, their research on what others had done shaped some of what they had already planned for the new president. The research they did was based on the public record of the president's schedule, newspaper stories mostly, and things of that sort. And that, unfortunately, is not the only available record for such activities. The National Archives keeps records on the president's activities minute by minute by combining the logs of the Secret Service, the Appointments Office, and the White House ushers, the ones who operate the upstairs. So, by looking at the records of, say, 2 presidents covered in the planning stages, we can take a guess as to how close to accurate a guide these past planning efforts had developed. Here are the Kennedy and Carter estimates from the planning staffs of the 2 presidents who planned for their transition on all 3 of these categories, along with the actual records from the archives for press conferences. Obviously, the planners do a pretty good job on presidential press conferences. That is, they estimated that Kennedy had 10 press conferences, and he actually did have 10 press conferences. They estimated Carter had 6, and he actually had 10. Obviously, they did a pretty good job estimating from public records what had happened on public events. That was true of things like travel, which are also public activities associated with the president. The story changes pretty dramatically, though, when we consider more important events that are not always likely to appear in the public eye. For example, meetings with the congressional leaders and meetings with interest groups. Here, the planning information on what presidential schedules have looked like in the past is pretty far off. Between 100 and 200% underestimating the real statistics for Carter, and between 700 and 1,000% underestimating the real statistics for Kennedy. In other words, the 2 planning efforts for the Reagan and Bush White Houses did a pretty poor job of figuring out what past presidents had done. The point of this simple exercise is not to show how far off planning efforts can be, since planning is what, after all, the chiefs recommended, but instead it is to suggest how far off our public perception is of what the president actually does all day. I will have some more to say about such expectations in the final rule. But for now, it is worth noting that when it comes to keeping the president moving, the White House staff soon finds out it needs to move faster than they had ever anticipated. Lesson 6, keeping the president's time moving means you have to control it. Not only must the president's time be used wisely because it is his most valuable asset, but also because using the president's time has consequences for the White House staff. Because the president's time has such extraordinary value, people cannot come to the Oval Office without being prepared. Meeting agendas cannot drift off topic. In short, the Chief of Staff talked about what they called orchestrating presidential meetings. But that orchestration takes effort prior to any meeting with the president. Here is an example of the president's morning schedule. This rule dictates that whenever there is something in the president's schedule, say a meeting with the National Security Advisor, pictured here, then there will be meetings prior to that meeting to clarify the agenda and set the tone and decide on the issues to bring to the president's attention in that meeting. So if you were to see the National Security Advisor's schedule, you would see meetings on her schedule prior to this briefing at 8:15, preparing her for briefing the president. There is, of course, a senior staff meeting at 7:30 in the morning in preparation for the Chief of Staff's meeting with the President at 9 a.m., so her preparation time has to occur before that. So maybe she is briefed by her NSC staff at 7 in the morning, just when the President is starting his day. And so the staff from the NSC must start their days at 6 a.m. in order to brief the NSA so that she can be prepared to brief the President at his 8 a.m. briefing. So when you ask these guys when their day starts and when it ends, they will tell you they wake up at 4 in the morning and they come home from work at 10 or 11 at night. Every day, Sundays too. So how hard the President works gets magnified in how hard his staff must work in order to maximize his time. Lessons 5 and 4 have to do with what chiefs of staff often come to decide is the main business of White Houses, crisis management. That would make sense since a full third of all chiefs of staff assumed office after a crisis had claimed their predecessor. And for the other 2/3, many had to face more than one critical time while in office. Number 5 is an interesting rule because it brings to the fore something of a dilemma for a working White House. Number 5, if you're ready for a crisis, you haven't been working hard enough. If an administration's current operation can accommodate the extraordinary challenges presented to it by an unexpected crisis, then that same staff system must not have been working previously at its full capacity. In effect, the ability to accommodate a crisis implies underutilization in normal times. Former White House Chief of Staff John Sununu recalled at the forum that President George H.W. Bush chose to maintain his staff operation at less than full capacity in order to provide for crisis capacity should the need arise. In other words, they didn't work all that hard. Most chiefs, on the other hand, looked at him askance in almost amazement. It would never occur to them. Most chiefs would not take that course with their staffs, preferring instead to work full bore in the here and now for the President's agenda, rather than taking a more leisurely pace awaiting a crisis that, after all, may never arrive. On the other hand, if they cannot accommodate the kinds of challenges presented by a crisis, then the President's team faces a hostile world in which they may lose their agenda when a crisis does arrive. So, what is a White House to do? Most among the chiefs agree, in order to face a crisis, you have to make your reactive instincts serve a proactive purpose. There are 2 strategies for doing that. One strategy is fairly unique, and that is the subject of this rule, while the other strategy is so common as to be the subject of the next rule. For now, the first crisis strategy is, oddly enough, plan. Plan to work less. Plan to work rather than work less. Plan not for a crisis, which after all are unpredictable, but instead project the President's own agenda into the future. One thing now commonly reported on is that the Bush White House uses a senior staff planning group which meets regularly once a week on Thursday mornings and is sometimes called the Strategicroop, which, after all, takes advantage of Saturday Night's Live own skit on the President's unique language. One of the advantages of this group is that senior staff get a clearer picture of where they want to go so that when a crisis does intervene in their plans, they have a sense of what should have been on the horizon and where they should have been steering the ship. In a couple of instances in that first year, senior White House staff thought such planning had helped them shape how they responded to crises because they had thought out something in a different context that they eventually used during that crisis. Rule number 4 articulates the second and more common approach among White Houses to crisis management. Number 4 is wall off a crisis from the staff. A chief of staff cannot allow a crisis to derail the White House and the President's agenda. Yet many of the staff from the campaign earned their stripes in the close combat of instant reaction. And many others on the staff regularly face every day in a kind of crisis mode in their regular behavior. They react to crisis like the old fire horse who races to the sound of the bell. Often a crisis is where the president is, and after all, staff who prefer to congregate there will gravitate to a crisis if given the opportunity. At the forum, Leon Panetta, President Clinton's second chief of staff, noted that in a crisis during the early Clinton White House, staff often resembled what he called a schoolyard soccer game. Everyone ran to where the ball was, wildly kicking and thrashing about, while few remained at their posts carrying out their primary business. The president's agenda, however, is so big, and the process that it takes to make it law is so lumbering, that to draw everyone's attention into a reactive mode sets adrift those things the president really cares about. And when the crisis has passed, it is the president's agenda that must remain. In Washington, if the president's agenda is not moving forward, it has been slipping backwards. The secret to the White House crisis management plan, then, is to wall off the crisis from the staff by creating a crisis team and keeping everyone else as far away from the crisis as possible. Often the best thing to do is to bring in outside experts, which is what the Clinton administration typically did, to handle the crisis for the president rather than engaging his core staff. Surprisingly enough, continuing to move the president's agenda forward often helps the crisis itself, usually, especially when it is bad news that the crisis is made up of, because moving their own presidential agenda forward makes good news that can often drown out the crisis itself. One of the reasons the Lewinsky crisis took so long to mount was that for the first month, it never got on the front page of the Washington Post. Every day, the Clinton White House, made news that buried the looming crisis beneath announcements of budget surpluses, job growth, and progress on a host of policy fronts more central to the president's agenda. Rule number 3, orchestrate fair decisions. Henry Kissinger used to say that when decisions come to the president, they are always 49 one way and 51 the other. If they weren't like that, after all, he said, then why should the president need to see them? So, who sees the president and what they say is critical to the kinds of decisions the president faces. The life of any White House comes from these very opportunities a senior staff has to advise the president on policies that matter. That opportunity is the motivation that gets them up every day and brings them into the office to bear these extraordinary burdens they bear. The opportunity spurs them on, and it is the well source of presidential initiative. Of course, on those issues most important to any particular staffer, he or she would prefer that simply the president do what he's told to do, while recognizing that on other issues, the president's influence depends upon allowing others to voice some range of opinion. Every White House then faces what I call an operational dilemma: how to spur on the initiative of staff without jeopardizing the president's advice, which depends, after all, on considered choices. Most of the chiefs of staff regard what they call a, quote, fair, unquote, process as the key to this dilemma. In their opinion, the White House staff needs to know what presidential choice that every presidential choice will involve them in those issues they care about the most. That regardless of the president's choice, they have had a chance to influence that decision. Otherwise, staff get the idea that there is no opportunity for them to affect policy, and since ultimately their interests often lie in policy advancement, they may go outside the administration in order to muster support for their counsel. And that, of course, leads to the destructive leaks and anonymous source stories on policy alternatives which often dot the landscape of presidential decisions. So, fortunately, we have a very nice and pretty easy way to measure the effectiveness of the internal decision process that chiefs of staff organize. We can look at how many stories are leaked outside the White House from anonymous insiders to the Washington Post or the New York Times in a typical presidency, say during his first 100 days, his first 180 days, and his first year. So, I will put up on the screen here those numbers. Down the left side are the average number of leaks per time period by the average White House. The right column is the record for President Bush's White House. As is apparent, the typical first 100 days of a typical presidency sees about 8 leaks to the New York Times or the Washington Post. During his first 100 days in office, the Bush White House had 0 leaks. In the first 180 days through July, the average White House has 12 leaks, and the Bush White House had 0 leaks. And through the first year, the average White House has 18 leaks from its insiders, and the Bush White House had, wait for it, 0 leaks. This is actually an extraordinary record of staff discipline, and I would argue a tribute to the management style inside the White House, which the Baker Institute's presidential transition project had something to do with, that gives the president's staff a sense of common enterprise. Rule number 2, secure a balanced White House staff. Observers of White Houses in both the press and academia often note that running against an opponent takes a set of habits very different from those required to govern with that same opponent. They argue for dumping the campaign staff in favor of hiring a White House staff laden with Washington insiders and Washington experience. If you look at the president's central staff right here, there's exactly one of the 5 central staff, core staff, who have such Washington experience. These pundits argue for dumping the campaign staff in favor of hiring a White House staff laden with Washington experience. Certainly one of the problems with the Clinton transition was his lack of experienced hands in his inner circle. Despite the difficulties with campaign staff regularly face working in Washington and the problems they often create, virtually all of the former chiefs of staff recommend against any staffing strategy that excludes campaigners. This is extraordinary since despite the fact that many of them, the former chiefs, are themselves quintessentially Washington hands. Instead, they recommend finding a balance between those familiar with the president and those familiar with the presidency. Both have talents to bring to the White House, one experience in the president's agenda and how he works and his priorities and how he got there, and one experienced in how to maneuver through the complexities of governing from a presidency not well endowed with points of advantage. Clay Johnson, the president's close personal friend, chief of staff of the governor, and initially the president's director of personnel, recalled that during their first 100 days in the White House, the president's senior staff oscillated between saying, "Is that what the president really wants?" to, "Is that really how it works in Washington?" depending upon whether they knew Washington better than they knew the president or vice versa. In fact, this is actually a sign of a good balance, as long as those who have one kind of knowledge want to share it with their colleagues who have another kind of experience. Then the president benefits from both of these kinds of knowledge put together. And here, a common enterprise is the key, just as in Rule 3. The last rule is probably the hardest to grasp for those on the candidate staff and often the key to every transition. It has to do with the same kinds of expectations I mentioned in Rule 7 on the president's schedule. Rule number 1 of every transition and working in the White House: whatever you have done before, you aren't ready to govern in the White House. Politicians and businessmen bit with the presidential bug always assume that the experiences they have had make them ready to face the challenges of presidential time. They usually understand the White House as something different, but they believe it only differs by degrees from what they have experienced in the past. When I was preparing for the 2001 presidential transition here at the Institute, one of then Governor Bush's chief aides told me, quote, "We don't want to brag, but Texas ain't Arkansas. Here in Texas, we play in the big leagues. That makes us ready for the White House." I expect somewhere in Massachusetts tonight there is a Kerry aide who is saying, "The senator has been in Washington for a long time. We know how to govern. We've played in the big leagues all our lives." The fact is, no one is ever prepared to be president or to work at the White House. White House operations have a distinctive scale, which is hard to appreciate. For one thing, they outpace work in every other setting. President Bush's close friend, Clay Johnson III, now Deputy OMB Director, himself a former Vice President for PepsiCo, described White House pace in terms relating to big business. At PepsiCo, he recalled, "We had some times when they were pretty fast-paced. Whenever we were about to launch a new product we had invested, say, $1 billion in, and whose outcome would either send our stock skyrocketing or crash land it. The difference was that at PepsiCo, that pace might last for a week, maybe once a year. At the White House, that pace lasts every day, Saturday and Sunday, Christmas, New Year's, all the time. When I heard this comment about the big leagues, Texas and Arkansas, I asked that Bush staffer who had made it to talk to me about the governor's personnel operation. The governor of any large state in the big leagues, like Texas, must find nominees for state positions. We've already talked about that in one of the other rules. I put up this picture of the president's economic team to illustrate the point. To fill these positions, the governor's staff must match a pool of potential applicants to the available jobs. In Texas, and as in other big states, the governor's office maintains a computer database on these applications. In Texas, that database averaged around 15,000 names accumulated over 4 years in office. When the governor's man had said this thing about the big leagues, I asked him if he had any idea how many job applications they would have to take care of in, say, the first day after being elected president. Of course, he said, he had absolutely no idea. 10,000, I said. In one day, they would have to handle almost the same amount they had had 4 years to process. After the first 6 weeks, I told him, you haven't even named a cabinet yet. The president's team would have collected 60,000 names, or 4 times their total 4-year Texas experience. By Christmas, only 12 days after the Supremes had declared Bush the winner in Florida, they would have had 95,000 applications, or 6 times their 4-year Texas experience. In the course of 1 year's time, they had collected 200,000 names, or 13 times what they had experienced playing in the Texas League. So let's go back to that baseball analogy. If Texas is the big leagues, then consider that a batter in the Texas League, say a farm club for Houston, like New Orleans, faces a pitcher who can throw around 90 miles an hour. And that's a really good pace for a pitcher in the minor leagues. If that were so, then by analogy with the presidency, a major league batter facing an Astros pitcher, say the Rocket, would have to hit a fastball thrown 60 feet away from him, not at 98 miles an hour, what the Rocket throws, but a fastball thrown at 1,200 miles an hour. For those of you who are familiar with flight, this is a baseball traveling 60 feet at Mach 2. That would make Rocket a far more vivid moniker if he had that kind of fastball. If Texas or the Senate or anywhere else is in the big leagues, then the presidency is actually in the Galactic League, playing for the Milky Way against other galaxies far, far away. And that is how far away from one's personal experiences are what you need to know to be governed from the White House. So what does an erstwhile president and his staff do with this final rule? The fact is that if no one is ever really prepared for the White House, then doesn't everyone start on an even footing? Instead of just acknowledging the immensity of the challenges, though, we need to better identify and then encourage those attitudes and strategies that properly outfit a new administration with the best chance they can have to do well against this kind of pitching, so that they are not just standing there when it comes by at Mach 2 to take that third strike looking. These 10 rules from the former White House Chiefs of Staff represent a good beginning towards that goal. And however late they are in coming to it, many in presidential politics are beginning finally to see the reasonableness of early and comprehensive transition planning, which in the end was one of the central reasons the Chief of Staffs originally got together. I'll be happy to take questions now.
As a former staffer for Lyndon Johnson, you excluded, do you really think you need a White House Chief of Staff? Because it seemed to function pretty well back then.
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that. One is, if you listen to, actually Lyndon Johnson is one of my special areas of expertise.
Right.
If you listen to the tape recordings of his phone conversations and his office meetings, one of the things that you're struck by, at least one of the things I'm struck by, is the enormous amount of his time spent scheduling himself.
He was his own chief of staff.
He was his own chief of staff. And as President Ford, there's a couple things you can say about that. One is it was a different time. The demands on government were far less than the demands made on the president. And secondly, it killed him. It killed him in office. He died within a couple of years of retiring. So he wouldn't even have survived a second term. So, as long as we're willing to have presidents live only one term and die in office, then it's possible that having a chief of staff is not one of the things that they need. But most presidents, and Gerald Ford is a perfect example of this, he started without a chief of staff and realized that the White House had become too large for a president to be his own chief of staff. And I think, secondly, when the president is his own chief of staff, he's his own worst enemy. It's just like a lawyer defending himself in court. He doesn't have an opportunity that a chief of staff provides, which is to put up a barrier to those who are interested in getting a hold of his agenda. There's nobody who stands between this extraordinarily talented Washington community who's interested in hijacking his agenda and the president himself. One of the things that all of the former White House chiefs of staff talked about at the conference was what they called oh-by-the-way decisions, which were times when the president came in contact with either cabinet officers or advocates from outside the White House, and they would stop the president and say, oh, by the way, Mr. President, don't you think this is a particularly good idea? And their experience was that every president that they had worked with had an extraordinarily difficult time saying, no, that's a dumb idea. So almost every president, when presented with that opportunity, especially in facing his own cabinet, would always grant access or consideration of some idea, even when that idea was an absolutely stupid idea in retrospect. And so what a chief of staff does for the president in this context is it puts a buffer between the president and these extraordinarily time-consuming and generally dumb ideas.
You'd be surprised what Johnson would say.
Well, I never actually heard him. I've never actually heard him on the telephone tell any cabinet secretary not to come on down.
Anyways, interesting.
Yeah. I don't think there's been a president since Gerald Ford, and you heard what Gerald Ford said. To not have a chief of staff is to put the republic in peril.
But he's not the greatest president around.
No, that's right.
By any stretch.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Right. So even he couldn't handle the job without a chief of staff.
But Johnson, if you recall, took a nap every day. He'd take a 2-hour nap. He'd be ready for the second working day about 4 o'clock when everybody's just dying.
Yeah. Yep, and that's probably one of the things that made it very hard to be on his staff. Right. He got to go to sleep, and they didn't.
Right. On this forum that y'all had, was there any discussion on the record or off the record of these chiefs of staffs of saying because of the intricacies, particularly with the new administration, of extending a presidential term longer than 4 years?
Yeah, actually there was a couple of questions asked of the former chiefs about the idea of moving to a committee kind of presidency where there were 2 or 3 people as president, which the founders considered originally to have something like the original Roman Republic, in which there were 3 praetors that shared power, which was an extraordinarily dumb idea. But in any case, it is one of the things that has been talked about. And the other was to extend the presidency to a 6-year term. And I think all of the chiefs thought that was not a very good idea either. And the reason for it, they thought, was it was, and this is a kind of typical response, if the guy is a bad guy, 6 years is too long. And if the guy is not a bad guy, but is in fact a good guy, then 6 years just isn't long enough. So you're better off having an opportunity in mid-8 years to say, this was a mistake and let's start over, instead of waiting another 2 years. And if the guy was really good, then you give him a new breath of life after 4 years, and he's got another 4 years, and so you've got 8 total. And I think that from their perspective, that kind of argument was very persuasive.
Do 2-term presidents often change their chief of staff in the middle?
Yeah, you can imagine given the amount of time the value of the president's time turns out equaling this extraordinarily difficult schedule for the president's staff. And that's double for the chief of staff. So most presidents run through chiefs of staff every couple of years. The record is 5 years as chief of staff. Andy Card is coming up on that. And it's probably the case that if the president wins re-election, he'll resign. And he won't last another. He won't make the record. Current record is owned by Secretary Baker. And it's an extraordinary record, 5 years. And he had to, as he said, he's the only man dumb enough to take this job twice. He did it in a 4-year stint and then in a 1-year stint.
What kinds of people are sent to the role of chief of staff? Like, what are their backgrounds?
Well, their background is extremely varied. The one thing that's common to actually, there's nothing that's common to chiefs of staff. Some of them, usually the ones who are not very successful, don't have very much experience in Washington. Mr. McClarty for President Clinton, Mr. Skinner for President H.W. Bush. And it ranges all the way to the other end, people who have held very high elected office. Secretary Baker never held office, but Senate Majority Leader Baker was Senate Majority Leader for a long time, a member of the Senate. So it ranges from former cabinet secretaries to businessmen to elected members of Congress to party leaders. So the range is quite wide. Typically, though, the ones who are not very successful are the ones who end up having very little Washington experience. They have a lot of experience with the candidate, and because they have a lot of experience with the candidate, they have a hard time giving him the kind of advice that controls and orchestrates his time in a useful way. So they have a hard time. In a sense, what happens is the president gets to run his own schedule, and when the president runs his own schedule, that schedule runs amok. And that's the modern history of the White House chief.
Along the way, was there any discussion of shortening the presidential election period in order for the president to be a little more effective?
That'd be a good idea.
Yeah, it would be a terrific idea, but the fact of the matter is that that schedule is not really anything that any single entity shortens. It's a product of all the parties in all the states. And if you could talk the parties into compacting the primary schedule, then I would bet that the candidates would just extend their campaign planning. The fact of the matter is, Governor Bush told his staff to start planning on winning the presidential election in August of 1999. Long before he announced he was going to run for president, he'd already assigned people to start planning for what he was going to do when he won being elected president. So I don't think this is something that the people who are the candidates would necessarily want to do. In other words, even if you shorten the campaign periods, the candidates are still going to go out there and campaign. So unless you're going to, by law, prevent them from campaigning, it's going to be an extraordinary thing to try to get them to stop them from campaigning. And after all, a sitting president, how can you tell when a sitting president is campaigning when he's just going out to meet the public? So it's really something we don't have anything we control over yet.
In addition to following these rules, are there personal characteristics that make a chief of staff more successful or less successful?
Yes, I think having a wide variety of Washington experience. You've been around the block in Washington a lot, and you know how it works, and you know how to anticipate what the president's demands are going to be and how to focus his agenda. And you know, if you look at a lot of these rules, they're about how to take care of the president's time, and that's often a matter of knowing what the demands on the president's time are going to look like. And one of the things that's clear from all of the study that we've done on this is that very few people actually have an idea of what the president does all day and what the president's time looks like and what the demands are. So you really have to know what those demands are like, and you can't really get that from afar. You have to be in Washington. You have to be in the White House. You have to have had that experience in order to understand the kind of pitching you're going to see once you're there.
How much reorganization usually occurs, like, if they stay for a second term?
If they stay for a second term,
Yeah, in terms of like the staff, I mean, is it 6,000 appointees all over again, half, none?
the average appointee, average presidential appointee stays in office 24 months. So the fact of the matter is, appointments and nominations to appointments is a constant business for the sitting president and his staff. Whether he wins re-election or not, they're in constant turnover, both inside the White House and inside the administration. And so they're spending an enormous amount of time. The presidents aren't, but their staffs are spending an enormous amount of time finding people, negotiating with those people, helping them through the process. And that constantly is going on, just constantly. One of the few things that have changed recently in the past two administrations, Clinton and Bush, we've had pretty stable cabinets. That's usually not the case, even at the cabinet level. But in those two presidencies, we've had extraordinarily stable cabinets. People have stayed at the top levels of the cabinet for quite a long time. But there's enormous turnover in the federal government, in the national government at the highest levels. Just an amazing amount.
Why is there a more rapid turnover, if you will, of White House press secretaries as opposed to White House chief of staff?
Well, one reason is, I don't know if you remember looking back at let me see if I can find, well, if you look at the president's daily schedule, chief of staff meets with the president at 9 a.m. National Security Advisor meets with the president at 8 a.m. Guess who meets with the president at 7 a.m.? The press secretary. So you figure their staffs have to start 2 hours before their principal ever meets with the president. So that means the press secretary staff, if the National Security Advisor staff is getting up at 4 in the morning to get ready for a meeting that takes place at 8, then the press secretary staff is getting up at 3 in the morning in order for the press secretary to meet with the president at 7 o'clock, because when the president meets the press secretary, he doesn't just say, "Hi, Scott, how are you?" He wants to know what's going on and what he needs to know about for the rest of his day. So Scott McClellan, or whoever the press secretary is, has got to be prepared for that meeting. And that means he's got to show up early, and his staff has to show up early. And so it becomes, there are a couple of reasons. That's one. It's draining on them physically.
So it's just a physical exhaustion more than anything else?
More than anything else. But the second thing is, in the White House, remember what the deputy press secretary said, in the White House, people listen to you in syllables, and every syllable goes around the world at the speed of light. There's no opportunity to make a mistake. And there's no human being on the face of the planet who's going to speak constantly for the President of the United States without making a mistake. And over time, the pressure to not make a mistake and what happens when you do make a mistake is, just a terrible, terrible pressure on that person, and it just wears them out. The person who is the most likely to turn over in the White House is the communications director. Because the president's, one of the top 3 responsibilities of the president is to communicate with the public. So whenever the president is not doing well, whenever the president's popularity is falling, we say in the business, whenever the president's popularity is falling, the body that hits the ground is the communications director. Because they're responsible for the president's communication strategy, and that turns over the most. Because in general, presidential popularity drops rather than climbs.
Any comments on why Ari Fleischer left?
No. You mean why he left?
Yeah, I mean...
No.
Okay.
No, I think it was mostly exhaustion.
Care to speculate on the election?
No. I don't do elections.
You don't do elections?
No. I do White House operations. I focus on what do they do when they win, not how they win.
Isn't it true, though, that you're an advisor to Senator Kerry on the transition?
No. I am not an advisor to Senator Kerry. I wasn't an advisor to President Bush. I'm not an advisor to anybody. I advise staffs. I want to make that very clear. One of the things that we do is provide nonpartisan information to campaigns. And we have provided nonpartisan information to the Kerry campaign. We had provided it to the Gore campaign and to the Bush for President campaign But no, I am not an advisor.
I wasn't implying a preference.
Well, no, and it has nothing to do with preference. This has everything to do with what is my status as a spokesperson for their campaign. I have nothing to do with their campaign except I give them information. I just want to make that clear.
Can you shed any insight on how former presidents have picked chiefs of staff?
Yeah. As you may know, Secretary Baker was the campaign director for Gerald Ford. He was Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Acting Secretary of Commerce under President Nixon. Then he came to work in the Ford White House. and then he went to work on the campaign. He directed the Ford campaign, so he worked very closely with the Chief of Staff in directing President Ford's campaign for re-election. Then he left office when President Ford lost. He left government and took up running H.W. Bush's campaigns for the presidency, which never quite worked out, and until after President Reagan picked him as vice president. So he was brought on to the Reagan for President staff as one of the principals of the Bush vice presidential nomination. He organized the debate preparation for Governor Reagan, and in that process got to know many of the core people in the Reagan campaign, in particular Mrs. Reagan and Michael Deaver. And both of them thought that what Governor Reagan needed, because none of them had ever been in Washington, was somebody who knew Washington well, and they thought they could work well with Mr. Baker, given the fact that he'd helped them on the debate preparation. So they asked him, and that was not an easy thing for Governor Reagan to do, because Edmund Meese thought he would be chief of staff, as he had been for the governor in California and as campaign manager. So typically, they ask somebody who knows them well or reasonably well, has participated in the campaign to a certain degree, and knows Washington well. Now, sometimes presidents put more emphasis on the former than on the latter, and that tends to be a mistake. That is, they emphasize their relationship and their personal experience with them, and that tends to be a mistake. It's usually better for them to find somebody who knows Washington well and can tell them what they need to do and keep the staff organized and keep it away from the White House, from the Oval Office.
Well, what does the position pay?
What?
How much does it pay?
There are 13 people who are, what?
130 some odd thousand.
Yeah, the chief of staff makes $150,000, which is $25,000 more than the other 12 what are called special assistants to the president. These are the commissioned officers in the White House, all of whom make about $125,000. So it's trivial.
But you get a nice car.
The chief of staff does, yes. The chief of staff has got a limousine.
He's never going home, so
Yeah, that is true.
It helps to have good tenants if you're Baker.
Yeah, maybe.
Jonathan, is there something you want to tell us?
no.
Yeah, they don't. One of the Secretary Baker often talks about one of his strategies as chief of staff was he always returned phone calls to members of Congress as chief of staff. What he doesn't say is that he always did that at 8 o'clock at night because he knew nobody would be in their office at 8 o'clock at night. So he would stay at the White House until 8 o'clock and then call up members of Congress so that when they got there in the morning, they would get a return phone call from the White House, and he thought that was a good thing. So he always stayed there till 8 at night, which meant he had to get there, 7 o'clock in the morning, something like that. So he was usually there for 13 hours, and that was on a regular day. Typically, these people just work ungodly hours, and as a consequence, they don't last very long. None of them do. So it's a game for the very young who have no children, or the very old whose children have all grown up. But if you're in that sort of middle age, between 30 and 50, it's a terrible, terrible burden on your families and everybody else. One that they all talk about.
I know you put up that schedule earlier. I was wondering how consistent are those schedules? From
Pretty consistent.
Day-to-day and administration to administration.
Yeah.
Have there been many changes over different years?
Well, sure, everybody's got their own schedule. You know, President Bush, even President Bush, for example, that was his schedule. President Bush's schedule has changed quite a bit because of 9/11. Several things have been rearranged in the president's schedule, and they tend to vary from time to time as they get a better idea of what the president likes and what works for him and what seems to be appropriate. But generally, there is a series of parallel meetings that are going on all throughout the White House in the morning, all culminating in various meetings with the president for various briefings, sorts of things. And all of those parallel meetings involve primarily the transfer of information among senior staff who are responsible for various parts of the White House, so that they all have a sense of what everybody is doing and what they are facing that day. Most White Houses tend to be built around, crisis. Oh, I'm sorry.
Ms. Lay?
Oh, sure.
You mentioned recording telephone conversation a minute ago.
Yes.
What is the rule about recording the president's telephone conversation?
Since Watergate, it's not a very good idea.
Well, are most of them recorded?
None of them are. Since Watergate. You can go to jail for what you say on the tape recording, so almost nobody records anything anymore. One of the problems in the White House, and Secretary Baker will talk to you about this if you ask him, is after the third or fourth year in the Reagan White House, and this has been true forever since then, the advent of special prosecutors and the advent of the destruction of, I forget what it's called now, sort of the politics of personal destruction. Once that got a grip on Washington, almost nobody keeps written records anymore. Secretary Baker will tell you, as chief of staff in the Reagan White House, after about the third year, he started tearing up his notes of meetings. He would go in and take notes of what happened, and then he would walk out and shred them, because he didn't want to be in a position where his staff was going to be subpoenaed. And, since subpoenas basically trump everything in government, executive privilege aside, it becomes an enormous burden for the principals and for their staffs. And mostly their staffs are the ones that are the ones who get hurt the most, because they're the ones who can least afford to be hauled before a grand jury. So almost nobody keeps notes anymore, and that's a terrible tragedy. And it's one of the things that for the last 5 years, have been trying to get scholars to focus on a little bit more, and that is, how can we bridge this executive privilege problem that we've got, which is we have no historical record anymore being developed inside the White House of presidential decision making, because it can all be subpoenaed and nobody wants to be subpoenaed.
Time for one last question.
How accurately do you think the West Wing portrays what goes on?
Well, actually, it's funny that you asked. I actually thought that would be the first question. It usually is the first question, and here's the answer. The West Wing is as a television show, is extraordinarily accurate about the process of the current status of decision-making processes in the White House, only it is in very, very, very slow motion. What happens on the West Wing television show is extraordinarily slow by comparison. One of the things there are two things that you always get when you walk into the White House by comparison with the West Wing television show. One is, I never have been able to figure out why it is so dark on the West Wing television show. The White House is one of the brightest places in terms of lighting that you'd ever be in. It's all white, and all of the outside rooms have these extraordinarily big windows, so it's very, very bright inside the White House. And the other thing, there is nobody in the halls. Work in the White House is so constant and at such a pace that nobody even has time to step outside their office. So this stuff that happens on the West Wing, where people are walking all around in the background and all this going on in the background and people getting out and walking down the hallways, that never happens. The White House looks more like a ghost town usually than what's portrayed on the West Wing. But in terms of the kinds of things that the staff talk about and the issues they deal with and the way things weave together, I think it's extraordinary. It's a very good picture of what the White House is like given the fact that we can't possibly see what the White House is like, because from perspective of drama, it would be so fast-moving that nobody could catch on. I mean, I sit down with my friends watching, and half the time they're saying, what did he say? What did he say? What did he say? Because they're talking so fast. So that's the story on that. I actually have I get asked this question so often that I actually have a screen to put up with the cast of West Wing on it. I just didn't do it when you asked that question.
This was a really fascinating hour.
And I'll be happy to talk to anybody afterwards as well.
Thank you, and
thank you for having me.
Appreciation.
Hey, that was great. Good. Yeah.